What happened to the movie musical? Usually, when you hear that a movie is a musical, you think about big dance numbers and show-stopping emotional beats, but that's not always the case. Some musicals don't necessarily have characters burst out into song for no reason. These films are usually considered unusual musicals because they're decidedly usual in their depictions of characters enjoying music. The first film musicals were brought to us by a man named Lee DeForest, who, in 1926, began producing Vitaphone or Vitaphone shorts, which featured bands, singers, and dancers. These were films that synced an outside soundtrack from the theater with images on the screen. One year later, The Jazz Singer, the first widely seen film using sound, both diegetic, that is, sound the other characters can hear, and non-diegetic, sound only the audience can hear, was released. Despite its pretty racist themes and imagery, the film is still considered a classic by film historians for its landmark marriage of music and film. By the mid-30s, musicals had become a staple of the picture house. Between the Depression and the early brewings of the Second World War, audiences sought wholesome, fun experiences, and musicals offered those experiences in spades. Performers like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers became international superstars for their musical prowess. As World War II continued through the early 40s, Americans thirsted for more movie musicals than ever. Between the years 1939 and 1945, there were over 500 theatrical musicals released in the United States, making this what many claim to be the golden age of the movie musical.
Why don't you?
What?
Make a musical.
A musical? Sure. Make a musical.
However, by the mid-1950s, as the middle class strengthened and we had more time to think existentially, our films followed suit. We no longer needed the sometimes irrational exuberance of a big dance number. American ennui was settling in very nicely, and for the next 10 years, there was a hole in Hollywood where musicals used to be, replaced instead by patriotic tales of American nationalism and heroic figures who conquer pure evil. However, this newfound nationalism, like everything else in Hollywood, did not last for long. This being America, war is always around the corner. The conflict in Vietnam stands as one of the lowest points of morale in American history, immediately following 2 decades of America at its most patriotic. Hollywood mirrored the hearts and minds of the people by attempting to give everybody what they wanted, and mostly failing on the populist front.
But suddenly my words reach someone else's ear.
Like clockwork, the Vietnam War went into full swing around the same time Clint Eastwood's notorious Paint Your Wagon released, combining 2 utterly American genres into one sentimental, false-feeling mess. The film stands as a relic from a simpler time, where Americans believed in the war they were fighting and the American ideals they were protecting. Paint Your Wagon is not a mistake, but a calculated production meant to emulate the former success of the golden age of musicals. But American audiences were troubled by the country's place in the world at this time, and they were, consciously or not, interested in more ambiguous and difficult themes. And this means Golden Age-style musicals were about to get a lot more complicated. Enter the problem musical.
The chocolate room.
Much like Shakespeare's problem comedies, which featured controversial, often taboo subject matter but always maintaining a happy ending, The Problem musical is a classically structured musical that focuses on potentially uncomfortable material. The most famous and beloved example of these musicals is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. While we may remember it as a relatively harmless children's film that teaches simple life lessons about materialism and greed, you could argue that it's one of the most violent and cynical family films ever made, where the petty mistakes of children are punishable by death. Though, to be fair, it's arguable as to whether the children actually die in the film. They die. Narrative realism became the primary focus of academics and artists once again after a couple of decades mired in modernism. Authors like Richard Yates wrote about realistic American families in Revolutionary Road, and filmmakers like John Cassavetes were interested in difficult themes and realistic settings like A Woman Under the Influence. The musical, as we had come to know it, had become mostly marginalized at this point, with many audiences no longer accepting the conceit that people will just get up and start dancing for no reason. Robert Altman's Nashville may be one of the best examples of a problem musical bridging the gap between whimsical fantasy and realism. In the film, nearly every character is a professional singer, and nearly every song is performed live on stage. We can accept these musical numbers as actual performance, but the songs themselves still stand as the Greek chorus of the film's themes.
It ain't no good. I'd give a lot to love you the way I used to do. Wish I could.
Several musicals followed suit, either in a narrative form or as full-blown concert films. In fact, the only notable exceptions of this kind are musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar or Grease, films that play both on nostalgic cinematic conventions and well-worn stories American audiences have been paying for years. Like any other medium, the longer it exists, the more fractured it becomes. Like America itself, the cinematic musical has taken on many shapes and definitions since the advent of the problem musical. What was once, by definition, an exuberant celebration of human hope has become nothing more than a tool for filmmakers to use, no different from using a fade or a sound effect. In the current cinematic landscape, you'll find musical numbers and non-musicals, complete with song and dance. Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia contains a show-stopping musical number in the middle of its climax with no real explanation. However, because of our knowledge of musicals as a piece of our cinematic lexicon, we know what is happening on screen. Films are artificial, and our attempts at realism are just that. Our suspension of disbelief can carry us through a story, but we always know what we're seeing as false. In this way, inserting a musical element into a non-musical is not altogether jarring, depending on the circumstances of the scene. In David Byrne's True Stories, we get a hybrid of the whimsical and realistic musical. The songs are almost always performances, but the performances themselves are reappropriated. A woman calling out the names of different clothes designers sings a song halfway through her presentation. It's a celebration of music shown through the character's inability to escape it. David Byrne's film focuses on the fractured nature of a musical to mirror American life and its many contradictions. It's a good fit. After all, a musical is intrinsically fractured. Sometimes we are singing and dancing, and sometimes we're not. Sometimes music is playing, but we see no instruments. Lars von Trier's Dancer in the Dark, perhaps the bleakest movie musical ever made, takes full advantage of the disparity of logic found in most musicals by centering on a woman in a horrible situation who uses her love of musicals to overcome her feelings of loss and suffering. Without our basic cultural understanding of musicals and their many changing rules, the film would not make much sense. It uses our own experiences with fractured narratives to create its own unique vision of the world where not everybody gets married in the end.
Is falling, the sun is gone to bed.
Other films use this technique to convey the many faces of their characters. John Cameron Mitchell's Hedwig and the Angry Inch is a movie about a literally incomplete person trying to become whole. The musical numbers are increasingly blurred with the realistic world until they are one, symbolizing the union of the different versions of Hedwig herself. Like modernism and realism before it, the movie musical's evolution is not necessarily tied to chronology. We just have more versions of them now than ever before. Some classically structured musicals are being made, but they're coming out alongside other variations of the genre. So when somebody complains that there aren't enough musicals around, tell them they just don't make them like they used to. Sort of.
Heart full of love, no fear, no regret,
My name is Marius Pontmercy.
and mine's Cosette.
Cosette, I don't know what to say.
Then make no sound.
I am lost.